President Joe Biden is expected to speak with Xi Jinping in the coming weeks. The news of their anticipated talks comes as U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan met with Xi in Beijing earlier today as part of his visit to China. So for more on that anticipated meeting and Sullivan's trip, we want to bring in CBS News intelligence and national security reporter Olivia Gazis. So I don't know if the two men have already met or they have yet to meet, Olivia, but you can sort of shed some light on that. And what are we learning about the expectations for this conversation?
Sure. Well, this trip by Jake Sullivan to Beijing is part of the sort of very methodical diplomacy that always takes place before any type of leadership level interaction gets put on the books. So his trip took place in order to lay out the priorities for what the White House has said is going to be a phone call between the two leaders expected to be scheduled in the coming weeks. From here, if past is precedent, what you can expect is the top diplomat from China, Wang Yi, to come visit the United States and probably have a reciprocal visit with President Biden in order to lay further groundwork for that phone call. Sullivan hinted after his meetings today that the phone call may precede an in-person interaction between the two leaders who are expected to attend two summits elsewhere in the world later this year.
Okay, that's very interesting because I thought to myself, usually two leaders meet, not a leader and, for lack of a better phrase, sort of an underling, a national security advisor. But I see that the expectation is the same will happen here. So what are the big issues that they are focusing on?
Sure. Well, and to your point, I mean, this is, again, sort of the very carefully orchestrated set of diplomatic moves that usually are, part of the lead up to a leadership level interaction. And this was Sullivan's first trip to Beijing as national security advisor. He's the first national security advisor since Susan Rice was in the role to go over there. And it was part of this effort to keep channels of communication open in Beijing, which has been a top priority for this administration. They set up a military-to-military channel of communication. Diplomatic talks have been ongoing, and there's an intelligence channel that's been opened that's gotten a little bit less attention. But that's all part of an effort to manage the various tensions, very real tensions that exist between Washington and Beijing. There are tensions over close calls in the South China Sea, over Beijing's plans for the reunification potentially of Taiwan, over China's support for Russia's military effort in Ukraine. There are Americans that are still detained in China. And there's, of course, China's involvement in the export of fentanyl precursor chemicals that the U.S. has been working with Beijing in order to tamp down. And so apart from laying the groundwork for the leadership interaction, it's probably on that front, on the fentanyl precursor chemicals, that there's been the most meaningful traction. The Chinese have taken some baby steps in order to rein in the export of those chemicals, and is probably the most meaningful diplomatic success that we've seen in the relationship thus far, because those other issues remain pretty intractable.
So I also find the timing really curious. I mean, we can't forget about how badly the relationship was going between Washington and Beijing when Donald Trump was the president. And now we are just like, a handful of months away from another election in which Donald Trump is also on the ballot. Is this also an attempt by the Biden administration to maybe just shore up some things before the uncertainty of this election?
Sure, which we know that the Chinese are looking at very, very closely. And yes, again, it's part of that sort of effort to very painstakingly rebuild the relationship. You'll remember, who can forget, that surveillance balloon that crossed over American territory that the U.S. had to shoot down last year. Communication all but ceased between the two countries, which was very dangerous because, again, you can have these near misses. You can have, miscommunications, miscalculations that lead to a bigger diplomatic or potential conflict. And so that's why Sullivan and other top diplomats in this administration had what were initially back-channel talks, very private, low-key talks elsewhere in the world in order to reopen the conversation with Beijing in order to sort of confront head-on some of these very real issues that remain in the relationship. And yes, the Chinese are watching very closely what may happen in November. We know from intelligence assessments that they're probably not going to engage in election interference in the way that Russia and Iran are in order to sort of tip the scales for either candidate, but they're watching it very closely and may in fact be targeting some down-ballot races because it's very high stakes for them.
Indeed. Olivia Gazis, thank you very much.